When France was liberated in the summer of 1944, the war did not simply end, it changed shape. The German occupation collapsed quickly on the surface. Paris was freed, Allied armies advanced eastward, and the tricolour returned to public buildings. But beneath that symbolic victory lay a country stripped bare. France emerged not as a nation celebrating triumph, but as one confronting humiliation, division, and uncertainty. Liberation marked the beginning of something far more difficult than military victory. It marked the moment France had to decide what it was going to become. For 4 years, the country had lived under occupation and collaboration. On the other hand, laws had been enforced by French police. Deportations had been organized by French officials. Resistance had existed, and liberation did not erase those facts. It exposed them. The immediate challenge was not reconstruction. It was legitimacy. Who had the right to rule? Who had the right to judge? And how could a nation rebuild itself without first deciding who belonged to it? The answer France reached was brutal but decisive. Before factories could reopen or railways be rebuilt, the nation turned inward. It sought justice, not only to punish, but to cleanse. This process became known as the épuration, or also the purge. At first, it was uncontrolled, but between June and November 1944, as German forces retreated and Allied troops advanced, authority fractured at the local level. In many regions, the state barely existed. Resistance groups filled the vacuum. Armed, embittered, and radicalized by years of clandestine warfare, they dispensed justice as they saw fit. Across France, women accused of relationships with German soldiers were publicly punished in scenes that repeated themselves with unsettling consistency. Their heads were shaved, and sometimes the shaving was rough and violent. Sometimes it was ceremonial, but it was always public. Hair, symbol of femininity, dignity, and individuality, was stripped away to make guilt visible. And the women were paraded through streets as the crowd jeered. Children threw stones at them. Some women were beaten, others were spat on. In some cases, sexual violence followed humiliation. These acts were known as horizontal collaboration, a term that reduced complex human relationships to a single accusation of betrayal. Roughly 20,000 women were subjected to this punishment, although the true number may have been higher. The reasons behind these relationships varied widely. Some were coerced, and some were transactional. Some were born of survival in a rationed economy. Some were genuine emotional bonds formed under extraordinary circumstances. But none of those distinctions mattered in the moment of liberation. What mattered was symbolism. Women's bodies became the site on which the nation projected shame, and punishing them allowed France to reclaim public space and assert moral control without confronting deeper, more uncomfortable truths. Very few of these women were tried in court. Their punishment was social, immediate, and irreversible. Men who had collaborated economically or administratively often escaped such visibility. Their collaboration was abstract, whilst women's punishment was physical. In reality, justice in these months was deeply gendered. This chaos could not continue. France could not rebuild itself through vengeance alone, and so the provisional government, led by Charles de Gaulle, moved quickly to reclaim authority. The purge was then legalized, courts were re-established, and procedures were defined. The government declared it would be severe with the great and indulgent with the small. The goal was no longer catharsis, but control. With this, new legal structures emerged. High-ranking collaborators were tried by the High Court of Justice. Major collaborators faced special courts of justice. Lesser offenders were judged by civic chambers, and finally, military tribunals handled war crimes and espionage. A new legal category, indignité nationale, or national degradation, was created. It allowed the state to punish moral failure rather than specific criminal acts. Those convicted lost civil and political rights. They could not vote, and they could not hold office. Many were barred from professions. Tens of thousands were sentenced under these laws. The political effect was dramatic. By 1946, the vast majority of France's political elite had been replaced. 85% of members of the new Constituent Assembly were first-time lawmakers. The Republic was being rebuilt from the ground up. Two trials came to symbolize the purge more than any others. The first was that of Philippe Pétain. Once celebrated as the hero of Verdun, Pétain now stood accused of treason. His defense argued that he had acted as a shield, protecting France from worse suffering while resistance fought abroad. Whilst the prosecution countered that Vichy had actively collaborated, registering Jews, suppressing resistance, and enforcing German demands. The court found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. But the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment due to his age and past service. Pétain died in custody, a figure whose fall mirrored the collapse of old certainties. The second trial was that of Pierre Laval. Laval's collaboration had been unapologetic. He had authorized deportations, he had sent French workers to Germany, and he had aligned himself openly with Nazi victory. Convicted of treason, Laval attempted suicide before execution, but he failed. Unfortunately, he was revived and shot. These trials allowed France to draw a line, even if that line simplified a far messier reality. Justice did not bring prosperity. Liberation ushered in what contemporaries called an economy of misery. Infrastructure laid in ruins. 50,000 factories were destroyed or damaged. Railways barely functioned. Industrial production hovered at 30% of pre-war levels. Adults survived on barely enough calories to stay alive. Food and meat was scarce and also tightly controlled. Children were prioritized, but even they suffered shortages. Urban populations suffered most. Rural regions often had food, but no transport. Goods rotted in stations, disparities deepened, and cynicism grew. By 1947, strikes and protests forced the government to abandon strict controls. The state faced a choice: return to laissez-faire economics or attempt something radically different. The government embraced dirigisme, a model of state-directed economic recovery. Under Jean Monnet, a modernization plan coordinated investment across key sectors. Targets were set, resources allocated, and growth was planned. Energy became public, transport consolidated, and Renault was seized as punishment for collaboration. These moves were not ideological experiments. They were emergency measures designed to rebuild quickly and decisively. America's aid through the Marshall Plan accelerated recovery, and with that, infrastructure modernized and productivity surged. By the early 1950s, France stabilized. Then it expanded. What followed became known as the Trente Glorieuses, 30 years of extraordinary growth. Agriculture mechanized, industry expanded, productivity gains translated into rising wages. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. A welfare state emerged, offering social security, pensions, and unemployment protection. By the mid-1960s, France had become a consumer society. But growth created new tensions. The housing crisis was severe. At first, they symbolized modernity: running water, heating, space. Over time, isolation emerged. Poor materials, weak transport links, and social segregation transformed these estates into zones of marginalization. A new urban fracture took shape. Culturally, post-war France was restless. At the same time, France's empire collapsed. The war destabilized governments and fractured society. The Fourth Republic collapsed, de Gaulle returned, and a new constitution created the Fifth Republic. In 1962, Algeria gained independence. Nearly 1 million settlers returned to France, reshaping cities and economies once again. By 1962, France was transformed. It was modern, industrial, prosperous, but it carried scars. The war had stripped illusions, and it forced confrontation with collaboration, justice, and identity. Sadly, this ended an empire, and it created a new and entirely different social construct.